In the Pacific theater of World War II, the major sea battles were for the most part fought and won by the aircraft carriers and the airplanes they launched. But while the battles were waged in the far reaches of the Pacific, the story of how they were won starts thousands of miles away in the clear waters of Lake Michigan. December 7, 1941, the Japanese Navy attacks the U.S. Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor. The raid decimated America's mighty battleships. But by a stroke of luck, the fleet's aircraft carriers were not in the harbor that day, and so escaped damage. Now at war with Japan, America was forced to redefine naval combat. A fleet once built around its battleships would now have to rely on the power of its carriers to win the war. But the power behind the aircraft carrier is its aircraft, and behind its aircraft, skilled pilots. Pilots trained in the touchy art of taking off from and landing on the small pitching deck of a carrier at sea. How and where would the Navy train these new pilots? Carriers could not be taken from the Pacific Fleet. They were needed in combat. Commander Richard F. Whitehead, then in charge of naval air training in the Midwest. Based near the shores of Lake Michigan, Whitehead realized that the lake's protected waters offered the perfect place to train carrier pilots. But where would he get the carriers? Throughout the early 1900s, a fleet of luxury steamships had cruised between Great Lakes cities like Chicago, Cleveland, and Detroit. Some of these ships had the size and speed Whitehead knew to become aircraft carriers. So, in March 1942, at Whitehead's urging, the Navy purchased the passenger steamer C&B. By May, the elegant liner was in a Buffalo, New York shipyard, where she was stripped nearly to the waterline and rebuilt in her new image. By August, she was the USS Wolverine. Shortly before the Wolverine set sail for Chicago, the Navy bought another steamer, the Greater Buffalo, which would undergo conversion to become the second of the carriers, the USS Sable. The carrier qualification training took place in the waters off Chicago. The Wolverine and Sable were berthed at Navy Pier. Each morning, their coal-fired engines belching smoke, they would steam out to sea. Just to the north, new pilots would take off from Curtis Reynolds Airfield, later called Naval Air Station Glenview, and rendezvous with the carriers to begin their qualification landings. By this time, the pilots were flying the aircraft that they would fly in combat, so the decks of the Wolverine and the Sable saw action from most carrier-based planes of the day, including the Wildcat, the Dauntless, the Avenger, the Hellcat, and the Corsair. If any of these aircraft were in short supply, a pilot might find himself back in the cockpit of the venerable SNJ Texan. To qualify, each trainee had to complete as many as 8 successful carrier landings, but success was by no means guaranteed. Hundreds of unfortunate pilots found themselves in many a compromising position, victims of faulty equipment, poor execution, rattled nerves, or a combination of all of the above. But many more pilots qualified without incident, including an 18-year-old ensign named George Herbert Walker Bush. The future president made his landings in the cockpit of a TBF Avenger. From 1942 to 1945, the Wolverine and Sable trained over 17,000 airmen. Equally important, the ships turned out thousands of carrier crew, the landing signal officers, deck handlers, and other functionaries, without whom the combat carriers could not function. It was an invaluable contribution to the war effort from an unlikely place. It's safe to say that the carriers of the Pacific Fleet owed much of their success to the work of their freshwater sisters, the USS Wolverine and the USS Sable.
Side wheels, old Great Lakes steamers, have been converted into seagoing schools, where pilots learn to negotiate tiny, unstable flight decks.